Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. Our previous two episodes were longer than usual. It still is the weekend of Juneteenth, and so I began reading The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm not sure when I will release this, but I wanted to read this on this weekend date because I felt it was of importance. And I'm just sort of getting to a place now where I think I'm going to start reading multiple books at different times uh, and so, anyways, we're reading this. We're continuing to read the Souls of Black Folk, and the reason these last two episodes were longer is because I filmed them outside as I was recording the episode in the podcast. I'm not sure how the audio is going to sound for those. There's going to be some background noise, so I think just on specific events and for specific moments, I'll go outside to record the Rock Reading Daily podcast. But I think the goal moving forward is to get these recorded in a inside space as often as possible to try to get the audio experience to be as audible as possible, so that way people can pull the most from these moments we have. And I also going to keep these next ones within 30 minutes as well. Well, within the 30-minute range. It just won't be as long as the last ones, I should say. All right, chapter 2 of The Dawn of Freedom, The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Careless seems the great avenger, history's lessons but record. One death grapple in the darkness, twixt old systems and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. Lowell. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. It was a phase of this problem that caused the Civil War, and however much they who marched south and north in 1861 may have fixed on the technical points of union and local autonomy as a shibboleth, all the nevertheless knew, as we know, that the question of Negro slavery was the real cause of the conflict. Curious it was, too, how this deeper question ever forced itself to the surface despite effort and disclaimer. No sooner had Northern armies touched Southern soil than this old question, newly guised, sprang from the earth. What shall be done with Negroes? Preemptory military commands, this way and that, could not answer the query. The Emancipation Proclamation seemed but to broaden and intensify the difficulties, and the war amendments made the Negro problem of today. It is the aim of this essay to study the period of history from 1861 to 1872, so far as it relates to the American Negro. In effect, this tale of the dawn of freedom is an account of that government of men called the Freedmen's Bureau, one of the most singular and interesting of the attempts made by a great nation to grapple with vast problems of race and social condition. The war has naught to do with slaves, cried Congress, the President, and the nation. And yet no sooner had the armies, East and West, penetrated Virginia and Tennessee than fugitive slaves appeared with their lines. They came at night, when the flickering campfires shone like vast unsteady stars along the black horizon. Old men and thin, with gray and tufted hair, women with frightened eyes, dragging, whimpering, hungry children, men and girls stalwart and gaunt, a horde of starving vagabonds, homeless, helpless, and pitiable in their dark distress. Two methods of treating these newcomers seemed equally logical to opposite sorts of minds. Ben Butler, in Virginia, quickly declared the slave property contraband of war and put the fugitives to work, while Fremont, in Missouri, declared the slaves free under martial law. Butler's accusation was approved. Excuse me. Butler's action was approved, but Fremont's was hastily countermanded, and his successor, Halleck, saw things differently. Quote, hereafter, end quote, he commanded, quote, no slave should be allowed to come into your lines at all. If any come without your knowledge, when owners call for them, deliver them, end quote. Such a policy was difficult to enforce. Some of the black refugees declared themselves free men. Others showed that their masters had deserted them, and still others were captured with forts and plantations. Evidently, too, slaves were a source of strength to the Confederacy and were being used as laborers and producers. Quote, they constitute a military resource, end quote, wrote Secretary Cameron late in 1861. Quote, and being such that they should not be turned over to the enemy is too plain to discuss, end quote. So gradually the tone of the army chiefs changed. Quote, contrabands, end quote, were welcomed as military laborers. This complicated rather than solved the problem, for now the scattering fugitives became a steady stream, which flowed faster as the armies marched. Then the long-headed man with care-chiseled face who sat in the White House saw the inevitable and emancipated the slaves of rebels on New Year's 1863. A month later, Congress called earnestly for the Negro soldiers whom the Act of July 1862 had half grudgingly allowed to enlist. Thus the barriers were leveled and the deed was done. The stream of fugitives swelled to a flood, and anxious army officers kept inquiring, quote, what must be done with slaves, arriving almost daily? Are we to find food and shelter for women and children? End quote. It was a Pierce of Boston who pointed out the way, and thus became in a sense the founder of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was a firm friend of Secretary Chase, and when, in 1861, the care of slaves in abandoned lands developed upon the Treasury officials, Pierce was specially detailed from the ranks to study the conditions. First, he cared for the refugees at Fortress Monroe, and then, after Sherman had captured Hilton Head, Pierce was sent there to found his Port Royal experiment of making free working men out of slaves. Before his experiment was barely started, however, the problem of the fugitives had assumed such proportions that it was taken from the hands of the overburdened Treasury Department and given to the Army officials. Already centers of mass freedmen were working at Fortress Monroe, Washington, New Orleans, Vicksburg and Corinth, Columbus, Kentucky, and Cairo, Illinois, as well as Port Royal. Army chaplains found here new and fruitful fields. Quote, superintendents of contrabands, end quote, multiplied, and some attempt at systematic work was made by enlisting the able-bodied men and giving work to the others. Okay, and so let's have a moment of reflection there. So what stands out to me here is I read a book that was entitled In Defense of Looting. I read it for the Rockford Reading podcast, or not the Rockford Reading podcast. I read it for the Rockford Reading that we did on Facebook and that we posted on YouTube. It wasn't on the podcast series, but I do plan to read that eventually on the podcast series. Each book that I read on the series is something that I'm going to be able to go back to in the midst of reading another book. I want to get to a point where, as we're reading through a certain couple of pages in a book, each paragraph connects to something from a different book that we had before. Each paragraph sort of builds upon something we've already started building before. And so I say all that to say, in that book, In Defense of Looting, was the first time I heard somebody pose the concept of slaves being property, and that it wasn't necessarily just freeing running away wasn't just necessarily freeing yourself as a human being, but because you were considered property, it was an act of looting. It was an act of stealing, taking property from an owner. And so these slave rebellions were like mass lootings. When somebody from say Harriet Tubman, for example, and I got to get to a point where I can know more names who have been of people who were involved in these events I'm referring to than just one, uh, just the mainstream name. But nonetheless, Harriet Tubman is of an utmost importance. Her name can't be mentioned enough times. And so Harriet Tubman going and freeing slaves and bringing them back north wasn't simply just freeing human beings from chattel slavery. It was also looting property from these slave owners. And that concept, hearing that concept to me, it added a double understanding to the importance that black people played in the inception of the country because of the free labor and the because they served two purposes. They were human beings, so these people got a like a 3/5 of the vote. You know, it helped them to be able to have more uh, political power in the South, and then it also got them free labor. You know, so they were like using them as human beings in a sense, but also considering them to be property. And then they were being able to have that property always being accruing, not always, but in some instances accruing value and appreciating, because they're forcing these women to have children and just not naturally, but they're building their workforce without have to going and hiring people out. And so then when the Civil War comes, that same tool, that same these human beings who have been used as a tool, excuse me, it becomes a double-edged sword for the South when black people are incentivized to help the Union and to leave the South and to get away from the Confederacy, because now they don't only now they're not now they're losing the human being that was there for whatever specific purposes. Uh, I'm sort of I threw that part off, but my point is that they were losing property as well. So they're losing things that they consider to be property as they're losing their workforce. And I think that that's just my whole point in that is that the role that black people have consistently played throughout American history cannot be overstated. That's how important it is. There is not a war that has not been won without an incredible sacrifice from black people. There is not a segment of people who had have had more opportunity granted to them that cannot trace back the avenues of that opportunity being granted to them through the sacrifice of black people or through efforts and struggles that black people were at the forefront of. So, then came the Freedmen's Aid Societies, born of the touching appeals from peers and from these other centers of distress. There was the American Missionary Association, sprung from the Amistad and now full grown for work, the various church organizations, the National Freedmen's Relief Association, the American Freedmen's Union, the Western Freedmen's Aid Commission, and all 50 or more active organizations which sent clothes, money, school books, and teachers southward. All they did was needed, for the destitution of the freedmen was often reported as, quote, too appalling for belief, end quote, and the situation was daily growing worse rather than better. And daily, too, it seemed more plain that this was no ordinary matter of temporary relief, but a national crisis. For here loomed a labor problem of vast dimensions. Masses of Negroes stood idle, or, if they worked spasmodically, were never sure of pay, and if perchance they received pay, squandered the new thing thoughtlessly. In these and other ways were camp life and the new liberty demoralizing the freedmen. The broader economic organization thus clearly demanded sprang up here, and there as accident, excuse me, the broader economic organization thus clearly demanded sprang up here and there as accident and local conditions determined. Here was that Pierce's Port Royal plan of lease plantations. Here was that Pierce's Port Royal plan of lease plantations and guided workmen pointed out the rough way. In Washington, the military governor, at the urgent appeal of the superintendent, opened confiscated estates to the cultivation of the fugitives, and there in the shadow of the dome gathered black farm villages. General Dix gave over estates to the freedmen of Fortress Monroe, and so on, south and west. The government and benevolent societies furnished the means of cultivation, and the Negro turned again slowly to work. The systems of control, thus started, rapidly grew, here and there, into strange little governments, like that of General Banks in Louisiana, with its 90,000 black subjects, its 50,000 guided laborers, and its annual budget of $100,000 or more. It made out 4,000 payrolls a year, registered all freedmen, inquired into grievances and redressed them, laid and collected taxes, and established a system of public schools. So, too, Colonel Eden, the superintendent of Tennessee and Arkansas, ruled over 100,000 freedmen, leased and cultivated 7,000 acres of cotton land, and fed 10,000 paupers a year. In South Carolina was General Saxton, with his deep interest in black folk. He succeeded Pierce and the Treasury officials and sold forfeited estates, leased abandoned plantations, encouraged schools, and received from Sherman, after that terribly picturesque march to the sea, thousands of the wretched camp followers. Three, three characteristic things one might have seen in Sherman's raid through Georgia, which threw the new situation in shadowy relief: the conqueror, the conquered, and the Negro. Some see all significance in the grim front of the destroyer, and some in the bitter sufferers of the lost cause. But to me, neither soldier nor fugitive speaks with so deep a meaning as that dark human cloud that clung like remorse on the rear of those swift columns, swelling at times to half their size, almost engulfing and choking them. In vain, in vain were they ordered back, in vain were bridges hewn from beneath their feet. On they trudged and withered. My fault. It'd be like a snowball effect. You start messing one word up, and then it ain't like the next word you about to read finna be no easier. All right, hold on. Let me get back to where I was at. On they trudged and writhed and surged until they rode into Savannah, a starved and naked horde of tens of thousands. There too came the characteristic military remedy. Quote, the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, are reserved and set apart for the settlement of Negroes now made free by act of war. End quote. So read the celebrated, quote, Field Order Number 15, end quote. All these experiments, orders, and systems were bound to attract and perplex the government and the nation. Directly after the Emancipation Proclamation, Representative Elliott had introduced a bill creating a Bureau of Emancipation, but it was never reported. The following June, a committee of inquiry appointed by the Secretary of War reported in favor of a temporary bureau for the, quote, improvement, protection, and employment of refugee freedmen, end quote, on much the same lines as were afterwards followed. Petitions came into President Lincoln from distinguished citizens and organizations, strongly urging a comprehensive and unified plan of dealing with the freedmen under a bureau which should be, quote, charged with the study of plans and execution of measures for easily guiding and in every way judiciously and humanely aiding the passage of our emancipated and yet to be emancipated blacks from the old condition of forced labor to their new state of voluntary industry, end quote. Some half-hearted steps were taken to accomplish this, in part, by putting the whole matter again in charge of the special Treasury agents. Laws of 1863 and 1864 directed them to take charge of and lease abandoned lands for periods not exceeding 12 months, and to, quote, provide in such leases or otherwise for the employment and general welfare, end quote, of the freedmen. Most of the Army officers greeted this as a welcome relief from perplexing, quote, Negro affairs, end quote, and Secretary Fesden, July 29th, 18... Okay, I must have messed this up. Hold on. Okay, let's try to get that sentence right. Most of the Army officers greeted this as a welcome relief from perplexing, quote, Negro affairs, end quote, and Secretary Fessenden, July 29th, 1864, issued an excellent system of regulations, which were afterwards closely followed by General Howard. Under Treasury agents, large quantities of land were leased in the Mississippi Valley, and many Negroes were employed. But in August 1864, the new regulations were suspended for reasons of, quote, public policy, end quote, and the Army was again in control. Meanwhile, Congress had turned its attention to the subject, and in March, the House passed a bill by a majority of two established. Meanwhile, Congress had turned its attention to the subject, and in March, the House passed a bill by a majority of two establishing a bureau for freedmen in the War Department. Charles Sumner, who had charge of the bill in the Senate, argued that freedmen and abandoned lands ought to be under the same department and reported a substitute for the House bill attaching the Bureau to the Treasury Department. This bill passed, but too late for action by the House. The debates wandered over the whole policy of the administration and the general question of slavery, without touching very closely the specific merits of the measure in hand. Then the national election took place, and the administration, with the vote of renewed confidence from the country, addressed itself to the matter more seriously. A conference between the two branches of Congress agreed upon a carefully drawn measure which contained the chief provisions of Sumner's bill, but made the proposed organization and department independent of both the War and the Treasury officials. The bill was conservative, giving the new department, quote, general superintendence of all freedmen. Superintendents. Okay, excuse me. The bill was conservative, giving the new department, quote, general superintendence of all freedmen, end quote. Its purpose was to, quote, establish regulations, end quote, for them, protect them, lease them lands, adjust their wages, and appear in civil and military courts as their, quote, next friend, end quote. There were many limitations attached to the powers thus granted, and the organization was made permanent. Nevertheless, the Senate defeated the bill and a new conference committee was appointed. This committee reported a new bill, February 28th, which was whirled through just as the session closed and became the Act of 1865, establishing in the War Department a, quote, Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, end quote. What I find interesting in there too, that term refugee, I just was reading Sister Citizen and she was speaking about the through surveys the different ways people reacted to seeing the term refugee being applied to people who were not from a different country. And within here, I guess the argument would be that since they were from coming from the South and it was a civil war, that it was a different country. But that word, it is a connotation as to it. When it's somebody who's within the country, when it's somebody who wouldn't, you wouldn't. Okay, hold 1 second. All these experiments, orders, and systems. Oh, sorry about that. My fault, y'all. Okay. All these experiments, orders, and systems were bound to attract and perplex the government and the nation. Wait a minute. Okay, I didn't turn the page. My fault. I'm tripping. That threw me off. Some of this stuff. Going back and reading things from the past like this, it just always my mind going so many different places. So excuse me. This last compromise was a hasty bit of legislation, vague and uncertain in outline. A bureau was created, quote, to continue during the present war of rebellion and for 1 year thereafter, end quote, to which was given, quote, the supervision and management of all abandoned lands and the control of all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen, end quote, under, quote, such rules and regulations as may be presented by the head of the bureau and approved by the president, end quote. A commissioner, appointed by the president and senate, was to control the bureau with an office force not exceeding 10 clerks. The president might also appoint assistant commissioners in the seceded states, and to all these offices, military officials might be detailed at regular pay. The Secretary of War could issue rations, clothing, and fuel to the destitute, and all abandoned property was placed in the hands of the Bureau for eventual lease and sale to ex-slaves in 40-acre parcels. Thus did the United States government definitely assume charge of the emancipated Negro as the ward of the nation. It was a tremendous undertaking. Here at a stroke of the pen was erected a government of millions of men, and not ordinary men either, but black men emasculated by a peculiarly complete system of slavery centuries old. And now, suddenly, violently, they come into a new birthright. At a time of war and passion, in the midst of the stricken and embittered population of their former masters. Any man might well have hesitated to assume charge of such a work, with vast responsibilities, indefinite powers, and limited resources. Probably no one but a soldier would have answered such a call promptly, and, indeed, no one but a soldier could be called, for Congress had appropriated no money for salaries and expenses. Less than a month after the weary emancipator passed to his rest, his successor assigned Major General Oliver O. Howard to duty as commissioner of the new bureau. He was a Maine man, then only 35 years of age. He had marched with Sherman to the sea, had fought well at Gettysburg, and but the year before had been assigned to the command of the Department of Tennessee. An honest man, with too much faith in human nature, little aptitude for business and intricate detail, he had had large opportunity of becoming acquainted at first hand with much of the work before him. And of that work it had been truly said that, quote, no approximately correct history of civilization can ever be written which does not throw out in bold relief, as one of the great landmarks of political and social progress, the organization and administration of the Freedmen's Bureau, end quote. On May 12, 1865, Howard was appointed, and he assumed the duties of his office promptly on the 15th and began examining the field of work. A curious mess he looked upon: little despotisms, communistic experiments, communistic experiments, slavery, peonage, business speculations, organized charity, unorganized alms giving, all reeling on under the guise of helping the freedmen, and all enshrined in the smoke and blood of war and the cursing and silence of angry men. On May 19th, the new government, for a government it really was, issued its constitution. Commissioners were to be appointed in each of the seceded states, who were to take charge of, quote, all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen, end quote, and all relief and rations were to be given by their consent alone. The Bureau invited continued cooperation with benevolent societies and declared, quote, it will be the object of all commissioners to introduce practicable systems of compensated labor, end quote, and to establish schools. Forthwith, 9 assistant commissioners were appointed. They were to hasten to their fields of work, seek gradually to close relief establishments and make the destitute self-supporting, act as courts of law where there were no courts, or where Negroes were not recognized in them as free, establish the institution of marriage among ex-slaves, and keep records, see that free men were free to choose their employers, and help in making their fair contracts for them. And finally, the circular said, quote, simple good faith, for which we hope on all hands for those concerned in the passing away of slavery, will especially relieve the assistant commissioners in the discharge of their duties toward the freedmen, as well as promote the general welfare, end quote. No sooner was the work thus started, and the general system and local organization in some measure begun, than 2 grave difficulties appeared which changed largely the theory and outcome of bureau work. First, there were the abandoned lands of the South. It had long been the more or less definitely expressed theory of the North that all the chief problems of emancipation might be settled by establishing the slaves on the forfeited lands of their masters. A sort of poetic justice, said some. But this poetry done into solemn prose meant either wholesale confiscation of private property in the South or vast appropriations. New Congress had not appropriated a cent, and no sooner did the proclamations of general amnesty appear than the 800,000 acres of abandoned lands in the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau melted quickly away. The second difficulty lay in perfecting the local organization of the Bureau throughout the wide field of work. Making a new machine and sending out officials of duly ascertained fitness for a great work of social reform is no child's task. But this task was even harder, for a new central organization had to be fitted on a heterogeneous and confused but already existing system of relief and control of ex-slaves. And the agents available for this work must be sought for in an army still busy with war operations, men in the very nature of the case ill-fitted for delicate social work, or among the questionable camp followers of an invading host. Thus, after a year's work, vigorously as it was pushed, the problem looked even more difficult to grasp and solve than at the beginning. Nevertheless, 3 things that year's work did, well worth the doing. It relieved a vast amount of physical suffering, It transported 7,000 fugitives from congested centers back to the farm. And, best of all, it inaugurated the crusade of the New England schoolmen. Okay. And we're going to end this episode of Rockford Reading Daily here. What stands out to me is that the first the first people that you would basically consider to be social workers, or people doing social work in with black people, were soldiers. And then when you think about where we are today with the militarization of the police, with the people who are basically tasked to dealing with the problem that is black people being today, being police officers, when you see soldiers coming out after when protests and uprisings take place, it's just a reminder of, again, what the question of what is progress. I think when we read books that go back like this, what we should be asking ourselves is, what is progress? Okay, and so on that note, please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Be on the lookout for a new episode of Rockford Reading Daily tomorrow. We will continue reading The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm going to continue reading this tonight and tomorrow in honor of Juneteenth. So I will holler at you tomorrow, but I will be back recording this in about 10 minutes.